welcome to everybody in the forum, including, I think, one or two people who've come from members of the Jubilee Debt Campaign. My name is Jenny Brown. I'm the Senior EU Relations Advisor here, but more importantly, for present purposes, I represent Christian Aid on the board of Eurodad, the European Network on Debt and Development. And Christian Aid have been a very enthusiastic member of Eurodad for probably more years than most other enthusiastic members of Eurodad. And it's a huge pleasure to have one of their lead policy people, Bodo Ellmers, with us this lunchtime. Bodo leads on their debt and responsible finance work. He's actually worked with Eurodad on and off for rather a long time, doing all sorts of other things as well. Today, he's going to be talking about the most recent report on debt, which is called The New Debt Vulnerabilities, 10 Reasons Why the Debt Crisis is Not Over. And having read through it as one is supposed to do when one introduces a speaker, it's a fascinating overview of why debt is still a problem after so many years, but also trends and the different ways in which it is and is becoming a problem. And I think that rather than talking any more about debt, I'd better let the expert talk about it. So, Bodo, you are very, very welcome, and here's the microphone.
Yeah, thank you for the nice introduction, Jenny, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here and present our latest report to Christian Aid and also the members of Jubilee Debt Campaign UK. Before I start, I was asked to present a little bit what Eurodad as in general is doing, because Christian Aid is, well, as Jenny said, is one of our most active member organizations since our founding, basically 25 years ago. And we do not only work on debt, but we work on development finance in a broader context. We cover all issues, all flows of finance that go either from the north to the south or from the south to the north. So we have 4 work areas. We work on official development assistance. We work on private capital flows. We work on tax justice and capital flight. And we work on debt. These would be the 4 areas. And in each of these areas, we are a network of 49 European NGOs representing 17 European countries. So one of our tasks is to coordinate the activities of these NGOs, to bring them together, to make them agree on common position, on common lobby activities. For this, we are organizing strategy meetings, conferences every year. But we are also producing a lot of research for members to work with. The report I'm presenting today is only one example. Other examples, I have some copies here. This one should be familiar maybe to many of you from Christian Aid, because you contributed, I think, the UK chapter to this. This is one example from our tax justice work area, giving with one hand, taking with the other, Europe's role in tax-related capital flight from developing countries. Or we recently published a report on the new EU's agenda to blend public development finance with private finance, looking at the risks and opportunities, and we found more risks actually of this new EU strategy to leverage development finance. Or we are also looking at, this is the latest report from our work area on development aid, official development assistance, how loans are reported as development aid, where we, for instance, found evidence that some donors are reporting loans which are actually non-concessional, which are actually profit-making loans as development assistance to developing countries. So this is research we are doing. And last but not least, we are conducting and we are organizing a lot of advocacy activities. On the one hand, we are doing advocacy in Brussels on behalf of our member organizations who are not based in Brussels or who don't have a representation there. But we are also coordinating many advocacy opportunities. For instance, I'm organizing meetings with the IMF executive directors twice a year, which are then open for all European NGOs. So we're basically trying to bring all European NGOs under one umbrella to make development finance work for development and under a larger social justice paradigm, so to speak. The reason why I'm here today is to present our latest report from the area of debt. The title is The New Debt Vulnerabilities, 10 Reasons Why the Debt Crisis is Not Over. The title might might be a little bit the surprise of you, because you might read in the news all these days that, for instance, Ireland is going back to the capital markets, that the EU is going back to growth, so everyone is speaking about the debt crisis is actually over. And when we look at the developing country context, we have much less awareness for debt issues as we had, for instance, in the late 1990s or the early 2000s, when we really had the big Jubilee campaigns which brought 100,000 people to the streets. This report was looking at the debt picture today and found quite some evidence that the debt crisis is not over. And this is what I want to present today, and also the reasons for that. Looking quickly at different country groupings and at the situation there, we did not only look at developing countries, but we tried to look at the picture overall, the debt picture, for reasons that I'm going to explain, which is because all these debt situations of different countries or country groupings are interrelated and strongly interconnected. And you cannot basically just look at the debt picture of one country or country group and neglect the others, because there are factors, there are mechanisms how these influence each other. But the overview is that in high-income countries and rich countries, we have basically the highest debt levels ever in times of peace. Only during the Second World War, debt levels have been higher. Sovereign debt is public debt or state debt. In middle-income countries, we have lots of money flowing in and out. We have volatile capital flows, and we have especially surging private debt levels, a situation similar to what we had in Europe and Southern Europe and in peripheral countries before the Euro crisis started. And in lower income countries, we saw quite some success of the debt relief campaigns over the past decade to bring overall debt levels down. But we see now less debt at much higher risks, a much riskier debt structure. I'm going to explain all this a little bit in detail further. Looking first at the first risk, sovereign debt is higher than ever in some places. You see here in this graph that debt in rich countries' debt levels surged tremendously during the financial crisis of the last years. The financial crisis basically started as a banking crisis, but it turned into a sovereign debt crisis. And the result is that basically, that we see debt to GDP levels of more than 100% on average in rich countries, which is much above the level of 60%, which is considered sustainable under the European Union's Maastricht criteria. The causes for this were, on the one hand, the financial sector bailouts, especially in countries such as Ireland. I mean, Ireland's debt to GDP ratio surged from 20% of GDP before the crisis started to now 120%, mainly to the bailouts of Anglo-Irish Bank and other financial institutions. But other causes were also the collapse of tax income due to the crisis, due to the recession, and necessary deficit spending activities of states, either economic stimulus programs or also higher costs for welfare programs, for unemployment programs. The consequences are pretty obviously the share of public spending that goes to debt service is up, and accordingly the share that goes to other public spending activities is down. This means that this affects, of course, all our life as Northerners, basically, because we receive less public services for our tax monies from governments. But there are severe implications also for developing countries. Most countries have cut aid, which were heavily affected by the crisis, especially in Southern Europe, Spain, Italy. The ODA budgets have basically slashed completely. We also see other contagion effects, such as less exports from developing countries into Europe, because Europe's ability to import from developing countries is down. This has especially affected countries in the Mediterranean region, such as Tunisia, Egypt, which have very close economic relations with Europe. And this is one reason beyond the political difficulties they have, why they are now in such an economic crisis. And also remittances to developing countries have suffered massively due to high debt levels and the economic crisis in Europe, because austerity policies have driven unemployment, and of course many migrant workers have been affected and remittances went down. These are several of the contagion effects between the Euro crisis and the developing world. In fact, I mean, the situation we are seeing here, this extremely high tax rate, would not be sustainable anymore if it wasn't for European central banks keeping interest rates artificially low and making it possible to keep debt service costs relatively low, because it of course depends on the interest. But the impact of this was that lots of hot money, and this is what you can see here, lots of hot money was flowing from rich countries from the north into developing countries in search for yield, because central banks in our part of the world have created lots of fresh money, but there are no investment opportunities here, no attractive investment opportunities. So lots of this money was flowing into the south, and which is an interesting thing. I mean, people like us, we usually try to mobilize more money for the south, but this is money that was not really needed, because this was hot speculative money that is not available for funding long-term development projects. It's basically just speculative money, and it can't flow back at any time. And in fact, this had already started to happen in 2013, when there was the assumption that, or the expectation that rich countries will raise their interest rates again, that this money flew back. And the impact you see is here that the exchange rates of emerging markets fell massively. That means the local currencies lost their value. It's a big problem because over the past years, when much cheap credits was available from the north, many actors in developing countries, not only governments but also private actors, took out loans denominated in foreign currency, and know that the value of their own currency is falling. They have more and more difficulties to pay back these loans, so it's becoming more and more costly. And in fact, what happened over the past years is we had, in the beginning of the crisis, when all this money was flowing to the south, we had basically a situation similar to the subprime crisis in the USA on the housing market, where lots of cheap loans were made available at very low cost to debtors which probably in the long run cannot pay the debt service. And this might not be the case in future anymore, and this will lead to massive defaults, basically. This is one of the situations. So especially middle-income countries, but also low-income countries are extremely affected by this capital flow volatility. One of the impact, it was extremely easy over the past years for private debtors in developing countries to get loans from abroad, to access external finance, because so much money was made available. And when you can see here, when you look at this graph here, you find it's the columns in red, that the additional debt the additional debt that built up over the past decade was entirely driven by private debt. The reason is, on the one hand, that campaigns such as ours, the Jubilee campaigns, have been pretty successful actually in achieving public debt relief, or debt relief of the states. We had about 130 billion in debt relief for low-income countries. There were larger debt reliefs for Nigeria and Iraq, and there are also now many instruments which make sure that that public debtors do not go too deep into debt in developing countries, such as the IMF debt limit policies. So public debt was basically stable. It's a dark gray color over the past decade, but private debt surged massively. And yeah, well, the consequences basically, I mean, we see increasing financial sector leverage, basically a situation like we had in Europe and the USA before the crisis started. We have private debtors which are extremely high indebted, and it's always questionable how sustainable this is going to be, especially when interest rates are going to rise again. It might be a private debt bubble. Funny thing is, when you look at the situation, we could say we have a kind of a neoliberal paradox that all policies and tools and instruments we have in the international financial architecture are about regulating public debt. We have financial responsibility laws in many countries which limit the amount of money a government can borrow. We have debt limits policies on international level that regulate public debt, but there's no such things for private debt. Basically, private debtors can take out as much money as they want without looking at any future implications of this. why should we bother about this? I mean, we as citizens and taxpayers are usually not responsible, we would say, for what private banks, what private corporations are doing. Unfortunately, yes, we are. At least this was the experience of the last big debt crisis, financial crisis we had. You probably all are now familiar with the term bank bailouts or financial sector bailouts. At the end of the day, a sovereign, a state has to guarantee the stability of the financial sector, which means that banks that are too big to fail or private debtors which are systemically important for the economy, may this be a big corporation, a big bank, whatever, need to be bailed out by the state, by the taxpayers. These are the so-called contingent liabilities of the state, and they continue to be enormous, both in rich and in poor countries. I mean, Ireland is actually leading. The graph is very difficult to read, but in Ireland, contingent liabilities, even after the bank bailouts, amount to 300% of GDP. At the moment, the public debt is 120% of GDP, so it's still basically 3 times the amount of public debt that already exists. And we have similar organizations in similar situation in developing countries, but we have much less reliable data on this from developing countries, which is why this graph only shows you the situation in rich countries, but situation is basically the same. And while we have now in Europe a quite sophisticated financial architecture that tries to de-link the financial sector and the public sector, that tries to make sure that that banks are liable for their own their own risks they take, like as banking resolution frameworks, such an architecture does not exist in most developing countries. So the risks are basically unmanaged. Having quickly another look at public debt. What happened over the past years also, this again for developing countries, is that public debt is riskier than ever. I said in the beginning that debt levels compared to historical standards are relatively low, but we are seeing now that donors are phasing out or the concessional lending. Concessional lending means lending at subsidized interests at very long time, with very long maturity rates, or it's not really being phased out, but it becomes less important as a portion of overall lending of developing countries. What we see instead is increased borrowing from private sources. This might be banks or investment funds, but also issuing bonds on financial markets. And we also see that developing countries are increasingly accessing the domestic market for raising money for public finances, which is, as such, this is a very good thing. I mean, this is basically, we never liked the monopoly of the World Bank, so basically the monopoly of the World Bank is a bit broken. We have new donors coming in, such as China. We have a better developed financial sector in developing countries, which generates funds. We have more trust in financial markets that even a developing country, a poor country, can be credible. can basically sell bonds. So we basically get a funding structure in developing countries which is very similar to those we have here in the UK, in Europe, that states mainly fund themselves by issuing bonds on financial markets rather than by taking out loans from the World Bank. But it comes with the same risks and with a number of downsides, which is it's much more expensive than the concessional loans. The interest rates are much higher. So the costs in future of servicing this debt will be much higher for developing countries. Then there's much more short-term debt. And what I said before, and over the past years there was lots of money made available to developing countries. This might not always be the case. And short-term debt is then very difficult to roll over. There can be a credit crunch, which makes it then impossible for developing countries to refinance themselves. And we also have big maturity concentrations now, and this is related to what you see here in this graph. We have the situation that over the past 6 years, 11 larger sub-Saharan markets entered the bond market for the same time, issuing large amounts of bonds at the same time. I think in Rwanda, the bond issue was 6% of GDP. They are all going to mature at the same time in about, I think it was a 10-year bond. So in 10 years, Rwanda needs to raise a financial amount of 6% of GDP to refinance this one bond issue. Otherwise, basically, it will be a default and so-called debt crisis according to this definition. So we have these big maturity concentrations, and we have now a massive creditor fragmentation. The situation we used to have in the past in developing countries was that, well, basically when it came to foreign finance, the World Bank was in the lead role, and you had a number of bilateral donors, bilateral creditors who also provided some funds, and perhaps one or the other bank. And when there was an unsustainable debt situation, a debt crisis, then they all came together, usually under the umbrella of the Paris Club, to negotiate and to negotiate a debt restructuring. This will not be possible anymore, because we have, when it comes to bonds, we have 1,000 different actors, investment funds, private individuals who are holding these bonds. And we've seen in recent debt crisis cases already that we had a massive problem with holdout creditors or vulture funds who are not willing to become part of a consensual solution of a debt restructuring process, but who are suing basically the debtor country for full payment. And this might become a big problem in future, because the way how we dealt with debt crisis in developing countries before, that we basically that governments assemble under the umbrella of the Paris Club or assemble under the umbrella of the IMF, will not work in future anymore, because we have this massive creditor fragmentation. Yeah, and this comes. This is where we come to the institutional dimension. Why the debt crisis is not over? One thing is very clearly because effective debt workout mechanisms do not exist. And this is not a new situation. We never had something like a state insolvency regime for states, which was one of the gaping holes, so-called gaping holes in the international financial architecture. I mean, an enterprise, a private corporation that is insolvent, that is bankrupt, or a bank can basically file an orderly debt workout, an orderly insolvency procedure. Such a mechanism never existed in developing countries, for developing countries or for sovereigns in general. I mean, you've probably followed the news about the euro crisis, this muddling through in Greece, and the repeated attempts. And yeah, there's simply no speedy, orderly, and sustainable way to restructure sovereign debt, which the implications are that it usually happens too little too late. Everyone knows that when there's a situation of unsustainable debt, you need to restructure, you need to relieve a part of the debt, but this happens too little too late, and it happens at the moment when basically irreversible damages has already been done to the social and economic fabric of a nation. I mean, you've probably seen Greece. I mean, GDP dropped by 25%, unemployment rate increased to 60%, youth unemployment to 60%, normal unemployment to 25%. This probably had not been necessary if we had restructured in the first place. It comes too little too late. When debt restructurings come, the decision-making is dominated by creditors. It's usually the IMF who's facilitating such a process. This is one reason why it comes too little too late, because creditors are not willing to write off their debt, so they're basically trying to delay or to procrastinate the process. And this gives creditors also an entry point to attach harmful conditionality to debt restructurings. This is usually this typical neoliberal structural adjustment package of privatization, deregulation, and liberalization, which is often mainly in the interest of creditor countries, which are basically designing the conditionality attached to a debt restructuring program. So the conclusion, we definitely need a new insolvency regime, because A, the old one didn't work, and B, the new situation I followed, I explained, with increasing creditor fragmentation, vulture funds suing crisis countries, basically proved that the old system did not work. Secondly, in fact, if all creditors and debtors would act responsibly, debt crisis should not occur. I mean, acting responsibly, this refers a little bit to the quality and quantity of, not only to the quantity, but also on the quality of lending. Responsible financing, as we understand it, and in fact, Eurodad has developed a responsible finance charter, which is another product which I don't have here. You can find on our website. I don't have many hard copies here. But responsible financing means, on the one hand, limiting the quantity of lending and borrowing. I referred already to the Maastricht criteria of the European Union, who would say no member state should take out loans or should increase the public debt level to more than 60% of GDP, because this might not be sustainable. For us, responsible financing goes much, much further. It's also about the processes related. Many of us campaigned on illegitimate debt, for instance. We had many, many cases not only in developing countries, in rich countries as well, where loans were taken out by dictators who did not use the money to develop their own countries, but to basically, to use it for their private benefit or to transferring all the loans to offshore centers, offshore financial centers. Of course, such kind of borrowing cannot be sustainable. Such kind of loans can never be repaid if they're not used to develop, if they're not used productively. So for us, responsible lending also includes process-related questions, such as the agency principles, that only public servants who have a legitimization by those who are ultimately paying for the loans, by the citizens and taxpayers, should have the permission to take out loans or to engage in loan contracts. But it's also about the targeting and the use of loans to make sure that, borrowed money is used for productive investments, that there are certain accountability mechanisms in place. So responsible financing is a complex set of issues, and I would encourage you to have a look at our charter, for instance. Our charter triggered what we are very proud of, also a process at the United Nations, where we have since last year the UNCTAD principles for promoting sovereign lending and borrowing, which is finally a set of responsible financing standards by an international organization. At the moment, however, there are only 11 countries endorsing these principles, and even in these countries we don't really know how good the compliance is. So it is basically all these responsible financing principles are currently soft law principles, which is better than nothing, definitely, but there is not yet legally binding framework for responsible financing, and there are also no sanction or enforcement mechanisms for these standards. That's one thing we are working on at the moment with the European institutions, but also with bilateral creditors and with the World Bank. And I said before that in fact, after the last big debt crisis we had in developing countries, there were debt limit policies introduced that should guide what kind of external finance developing countries get based on the level of debt to GDP they already received. And the idea was that heavily indebted countries only get grants from donors and no loans anymore, because it would providing foreign assistance in form of loans to them would basically boost the debt level to beyond the sustainability threshold. Unfortunately, these debt limits policies have been set by the same institutions who provide loans and who have an interest to do so because it's their business model, such as the IMF and the World Bank. So when the crisis started, basically, the debt limits were simply shifted because the IMF and World Bank got a capital in Greece and were under political pressure, but also had a self-interest to get the money out. So rather than providing grant assistance to crisis countries, which would basically be sustainable transfers, they received a big amount of new loans. You can see this in the graph. This was the peak of MDB lending, which led to a situation that, especially in the poorest countries, we have now increasing debt levels which are driven not by private debt, but in this case really by concessional lending from multiple development banks, who should actually be taking care of debt sustainability. But it's sometimes politically easier to provide loans than grants, and this is actually what happened throughout the crisis. Then to approach the whole issue from the other side, of course, debt sustainability is, or in general, for governments, for states, borrowing money is usually not the best way to finance public activities. Of course, they would prefer to finance. In fact, you finance only public deficits through borrowing, and you have a public deficit when your expenses are higher than your income, and your income is pretty much related to A, how much tax you raise, or B, in the case of developing countries, also to how much aid you get. And I think most of you work on these issues as well. We still have massive problems with tax evasion and tax avoidance in developing countries. About illicit flows from developing countries amount to about $800 billion a year, but we have basically the same problems in European countries of tax evasion, tax avoidance, offshore centers. It's a big, especially for Christian Aid, I know it's a big issue to work on. So that's one of the reasons why the borrowing needs are so high, is the tax evasion and the tax avoidance. And then we see also, unfortunately, since 2 years ago, 8 cuts for the poorest countries, which forced them to rely on loans to fund necessary expenses in poverty eradication, infrastructure financing, and so on. On the other side, we also see that debt service increasingly competes with all other sorts of public spending, including an essential service and official development assistance. So this is where we basically come back to the beginning, especially to the beginning of my organization 24 years ago. We still see that developing countries are paying $600 billion a year in interest on external debt only, which is 5 times what they receive in ODA. So it's not only illicit financial flows what makes them lose a lot of money. It is still debt, though the issue fell off the agenda recently. And if the idea is to have better domestic resource mobilization, but domestic resource mobilization not for the benefit of creditors, but for the benefit of citizens and development, then debt relief is really a prerequisite to make sure that taxpayers' money can really be used for citizens' needs. Thank you. Yeah, but that's basically here's just summarizing the essential steps to end debt crisis. It's life before debt, to promote the creation of a sovereign debt restructuring regime that is fair, independent, and takes developmental needs and human rights into account. The current regime we have, it's not fair, it's not efficient, and even when the debt restructuring takes place, the aim is only to make sure that that crisis countries can gain market access. So it's not to make sure that they can use their resources to fund development, to fund essential services. It's basically, you can basically say the current regime puts a loan contract as senior or more relevant than the human rights obligations of a nation. The loan contract is the more important legal document to honor than any human rights agreements as the current system works. And the second would be trust before greed, ensure the compliance of all lenders and borrowers with responsible financing standards. And then summarizing cash before loans, it's always better to have tax and aid in the first place rather than having to rely on borrowing, because it's very unlikely that continuous borrowing sooner or later it always leads to unsustainable debt levels and debt crisis. Okay, questions please.
Right, okay. Now is our opportunity to applaud, and then we can have a bit of a discussion. If people have got any comments or questions for Bodo, now is the opportunity. But thank you. There's been a huge amount sneaked in under only 10 apparent reasons. So thank you for that masterly presentation. I think from Christian Aid's point of view, 2 of the themes that have stood out for me are the role of the private sector in the way debt is developing, and also obviously the linkage between tax and debt. There are probably quite a lot of other things that I haven't quite picked up on. Are there any questions? Anybody would like to comment or pick up on anything that Bodo has said? And that includes colleagues who are outside into Church House.
Yes, it's John Garrett from Water Aid. Thanks very much for the presentation. Very interesting. I used to work on these issues actually quite a few years ago as part of the Jubilee 2000 campaign. So it's very interesting to sort of see the issues coming up again. And I was wondering really, just in a couple of questions really, which are the countries which are most at risk from your research? Are they amongst the middle income countries, or is it more in the low income countries? I'd just be interested which ones you see are really at the sort of most in distress or most at risk. And a sort of second question really, do you think that you talked about the business model of the multilateral development banks, so the sort of World Bank, the IMF, and the regional development banks. Do you think that business model is the right model, or do you think ideally there might be some other sort of multilateral institutions which adopted a different business model?
the countries with the highest debt levels at the moment are mainly middle-income countries. We have, we're calling about the Caribbean debt crisis at the moment. There are many crisis countries now in Jamaica is one of them, Belize and Grenada. I think Grenada already defaulted on the debt. There are also some island states in the Pacific. And low-income countries which continue to have extremely high debt levels are those which have not been able to qualify for the so-called heavily indebted poor countries initiative of the World Bank because they were mostly for political reasons. These were Zimbabwe and Sudan. These countries are those ones in debt distress, or in fact, I mean, you could say they are not really in debt distress because they're already most of them already defaulted on their debt, or some of them. So they're not. The question is always also for you what the debt crisis is. I mean, for creditors or for international organizations, the debt crisis is always when a debtor country stops paying its debt. Our definition is a little bit more a debt crisis when a debtor country continues to paying its debt, though it's a very poor country and should do other things with the scarce public resources it has. And there are a number of developing countries that don't have so significant statistical problems, but the problem is basically an endemic one that debt service is seen as a more important use of public resources than other forms of public essential services, for instance. Yeah, the business model of the MDBs. Yeah, it's of course. I mean, bureaucracies tend to reproduce themselves. Huh? I mean, that's you probably don't get rid of them so much. It's also. I mean, in fact, concessional lending is, of course, still better than non-concessional lending when it comes to the price of finance for developing countries. So from this perspective seen, it's still better to have the World Bank than to have only private sources of finance for poor countries. But on the other hand, I mean, we have this 0.7% target of to transfer 0.7%, and we're mostly speaking about grants to developing countries for many years now. And if donors would really provide these amounts of grants, the borrowing needs of poor countries would be much, much lower, and accordingly there would be much, much lending needed, and the debt problems probably we have again and again because it's, you know, that the debt crises are a repeating pattern. It's not, I mean, many countries are going through the cycle at least once a decade, basically, that would not occur. So it's basically the provision of grants, and of course what we're also working a lot on domestic resource mobilization, taxation is really important to make sure that we probably, hopefully can live at some point without the World Bank and other MDBs.
Directly.
Thank you, Bodo. It was really very interesting and alarming at the same time. I was participated in a conference in Nairobi organized by the Kenyan government and the IMF. There were representatives of venture capital, and I tried to point out to the danger of inflows of hot money, and then also for Africans to make a distinction between investors and vultures. And the guy from the venture capital said, every ecosystem needs vultures. So, and as you said, the in-country domestic borrowing and borrowing from private sources is increasing in Africa. In fact, issuance of sovereign bond is catching up now. And, you know, it started with Ghana and now it is increasing. So, and then you pointed out that there is no regulation mechanism when it comes to private lending and borrowing. What are the advocacy lines and the campaign lines to address this issue, which is really getting more problematic?
I mean, first one comment on vulture funds. I mean, we need vultures. In fact, I mean, we had some very aggressive cases of vulture fund lawsuits this year, especially against Argentina or also against Greece last year. The positive side effect was actually of these vulture fund cases that they triggered the reform process we're seeing now in the IMF and at the United Nations as well, which are really trying to reform the international financial architecture and finally trying to get this new debt resolution or debt workout mechanisms done, which we advocated for for 2 decades, basically. It was basically the vulture funds these aggressive vulture fund lawsuits who basically were a wake-up call for many policymakers on international level to take action in this regard, and we hope that we really get something going. So this was a positive side effect, but otherwise I don't think that vulture funds are necessarily needed. On private lending and borrowing, it's a very extremely complex issue. I mean, it goes really deeply about financial regulation in general. It's also, there's also the question of how interventionist you want to be. I mean, of course, it would be a little bit totalitarian to say that the state should prescribe to all individuals or states or banks how much loans they can take, but basically a blueprint, I think, also for other countries could be all the processes we have seen in the European Union since the crisis started. There was a lot of work has been done on better financial sector surveillance, supervision. There's this no banking resolution directive of the European Union, which tries to have basically resolutions funds which are funded by banks themselves, so that the taxpayer doesn't have to pay the price when banks, highly leveraged banks, heavily indebted banks are failing. I think these processes, they could have been better from a social justice perspective, but at least I think lots of things have been done in the EU context recently over the past 5 years, driven by events, basically, and I think, this can also be a blueprint for developing countries. It's really a concerning thing, of course, that especially the European Union has now doing. Everyone speaks about leveraging private finance these days. It's not only it's the European Commission, it's also the UK government, and no one pays attention for the fact that there are no surveillance regulation institution in the countries which receive all these new private finance. In fact, you would say the institution building should to regulate private finance must come before, at least hand in hand with attracting private finance to developing countries, and this doesn't take place. It's all, policymakers I find in Europe are acting really irresponsible by saying, we need to use aid to leverage private finance, while in the recipient countries there's the institutional framework and the capacities to deal with the situation are not in place.
Really interesting presentation. I'm Priya, the economist in PPD, same department as Jenny. I wanted to ask you what you think perhaps about the role of China overall in global debt. Firstly, its role in buying up a lot of the US debt, so being the biggest buyer of government bonds in the US. And secondly, its role in investing in Africa and some of its own domestic pressures on debt that have been well researched and kind of commentated on, but there are huge risks of asset bubbles in China right now, and if that explodes into the world's next debt crisis has been kind of possibly predicted, what does that then mean for developing countries that China is aggressively investing in now as well? So 2 comments really, and any thoughts there?
Yeah, China is an interesting case. What I said in the presentation, in fact, China has been very useful for developing countries in the sense that it provided new money, often at very concessional terms, and basically broke the monopoly that former Western Northern creditors used to have. On the other, you can say, developing countries have no more choice. Many of our southern partners say China is coming to our country and is actually providing new opportunities to us. On the other hand, Chinese loans are, from a responsible financing perspective, probably not always very compliant with the standards we would use to set. In fact, it's very difficult to laud or to blame and shame China. When I speak with people from the IMF, the main problem we have with Chinese loans is that we don't know what's happening. The Chinese are not reporting. No one actually knows how much Chinese money is flowing in there and what the use of the money is. It's a very intransparent field. This is why the risks which are related to Chinese lending are not even known. No one actually really knows how much money we're talking about and what the use of this money is. That makes it a little bit difficult, which is a finding in itself, because that means the risks are very difficult to manage because they're basically unknown, at least to policymakers on global level. On this China-US relation. It's probably, the two are the key reason why we have so many economic imbalances and instabilities on this planet. How long this will be for how long this will continue. It's a very. In fact, the Chinese put themselves in a difficult situation because they have now lent so much money to the USA that they're basically totally dependent on the USA being able to service the debt and on the USA having a strong currency, because otherwise they would lose all the I think $3 trillion they have now in currency reserves. But I'm not a prophet who would say how this how this would end. I find it a funny situation.
Hi, my name's Richard. I'm the climate advisor. I was just actually a sort of similar sort of question, but I was just wondering whether there was talk last year about a brick bank. Whether this is sort of emerging, is it significant already, or is it likely to be significant? I know there were sort of mentions in the media of it sort of becoming, the new World Bank, that kind of thing. I don't know whether. I mean, that's probably a bit hyped, but I was just wondering what you thought.
Good question. I didn't follow this recently, but I thought, as far as I know, the status is that the decision to found it was made, but it didn't start to become operational now. Yeah, this it's a big. It's also similar to China. It's the same pros and cons. It's basically it gives more choice. It's another funding opportunity, and especially the World Bank or other multilateral development banks have been criticized for a long time that they would mainly fund the priorities of their mainly northern owners and stakeholders rather than those of developing countries, of the recipient countries, which may or may not be true. There's probably lots of truth behind it also when it comes to country allocation, but also to sector allocation. So the BRICS Bank might also fill many gaps that the developing countries from an ownership perspective wanted to be funded, but have not been funded by the MDBs due to political constraints in their boards, which are dominated by the northern countries. On the other hand, we might see how the BRICS Bank will operate when it comes to civil society priorities such as human rights issues, environmental issues. So this will be seen in practice what the BRICS Bank is actually going to do and when it starts to operate.
Just in terms of the likelihood of the sovereign debt restructuring regime, I think you suggested the vulture funds had this effect of galvanising some policymakers on that. But it'd be good to know. Do you think there's a real chance it can happen or will happen?
We see many reforms, and it will probably be incremental steps. It will probably not a big bang that there's a new international organization such as the IMF born. Basically born overnight. It will probably be an incremental reform. There are now ideas, for instance, at the moment there is no international organizations or international organization which deals with sovereign debt only. It's under the umbrella of the IMF, which is a bank as well. So there are, for instance, ideas to set up a sovereign debt forum as a standing organization where debt resolution issues can be discussed. There are many proposals now to reform the instruments that the IMF already has, to strengthen the instruments that the International Monetary Fund has step by step, such as recently came from Brookings, came a proposal to set up a sovereign debt restructuring facility which provides crisis lending to debt crisis countries under the obligation that they restructure their old debt, and makes them. And if such a facility would be set up through a change of the article of agreement of the IMF, it would be international law, because the article of agreements of the IMF are legally binding. The problem is we need probably a mechanism to prevent the holdout creditor problem. The lawsuits problem is you need a process that is binding in international law, and there are very few mechanisms that exist. It's the Articles of Agreement of the IMF. Then it would be resolutions under the United Nations Security Council, Chapter 7. This happened in Iraq in 2005. It was a UN Security Council decision, which is why no vulture fund could sue, basically, or could file a lawsuit. And then the third option would probably be to have an additional chamber to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which would also make it legally binding for all signatory parties to this charter. So these are probably the three options to have a reform that is legally binding and can avoid all kinds of lawsuits. Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, a really quick follow-up question to that question. I'm Laura. I'm in the advocacy team here, and it's an advocacy-related question. I mean, you talked about the difficulties of advocating for that first ask about this kind of sovereign debt restructuring regime, but it strikes me that the second and third ask are probably going to be even harder to advocate for, and there seem some real similarities with the climate change debate, actually, if we're saying that for there to be, you need a real global agreement for progress to be made, but it's against national interest to have external interference or targets or regulations to affect their own debt situation, because every government's going to want their own flexibility. So I guess unless we go back 60 years to kind of the setting up of the Bretton Woods institutions, do you think it's realistic to think there's going to be global will to tackle these problems, or is each country going to keep their head down and stick to their own problems?
I must say, especially when it comes to this responsible financing, I mean, it would be good already to have simply a champion. Huh? I mean, it's one country who says, that would say, our development bank will in future only do things that way, and then you can start from having a champion to trying to get a regional agreement, perhaps on the European Union basis or then on a global basis about reforms. So I think this is one issue that can be really promoted on either country by country basis or really on an institution by institution basis. You could also look for a certain bank, or take the World Bank or the European Investment Bank, and try to improve the standards which they have for their own operations. So I think this is, the big reform to have all creditors compliant with, or a completely international agreement it's an ambitious task, but you can really make short you can approach this in a step-by-step approach. Yeah, and the other ask would be, of course, a sovereign debt restructuring regime. This is really must probably be an international agreement by a critical mass of actors at least. So this is a little bit more ambitious, but there's also quite some movement at the moment, because especially the Euro crisis has shown many governments that the current system doesn't work well.
Great. Anything more from anybody? I confess to considerable ignorance on the subject of debt before Bodo contacted us and said, could he come and talk about it? So thank you for enlightening me and actually agitating me. This is all really serious stuff, and it's been really helpful to be challenged and reminded about that. And I think you're heading off to Berlin for another speaking engagement tomorrow morning, aren't you? So bon voyage for that. And thank you very much for calling in on the way and talking to us about something that actually we really need to think about. So thank you.